Today's argument is an interesting point about the state of the meta that we have seen in the last few seasons, and a discussion arose on whether or not this evolution of the meta in Mythic Plus was to be the fault of tanks, or rather the power that tanks are bringing in a key becomes so necessary and powerful that it then shapes the rest of the group. So the healer doesn't really matter, just pick the healer with the most throughput or the healer that can save most lives. DPS easy, bring the ones that does the most damage all the time. The one that shapes the group the most is going to be what the tank is bringing. And this question was especially posed towards the change of the casting philosophy in Mythic Plus, you know, the one where if you use a crowd control, the mobs will continue casting right after the crowd control, so now you actually have to interrupt enemies to stop them from casting again, which was introduced again in the War Within after it already existed before Dragonflight, but that was like a half and half thing, a split thing, where some casts would be put on cooldown if you stop them with a stun, and other casts wouldn't, and they would go back to spam casting again unless you interrupted them. That was still mixed before Dragonflight. We took a pause, we took a break in Dragonflight, and then we actually went back in the War Within to have basically all casts require an interrupt to not be recast immediately after a crowd control effect is over. Therefore meaning, for example, tanks with the most interrupt become stronger, like Vengeance with their Sigil of Silence, or things like last season Pot Paladin with their Divine Toll, AoE Silence basically, and their Avenger Shield. Very, very high uptime on their interrupts. Now, one thing that is visible though is that ever since, from Legion to BFA and even upwards for most of Shadowlands, we haven't really seen, or weren't that used to massive dominance of tanks, or rather one tank to the level we are now. For example, in Season 1 of BFA, you did see Blood DK being popular, but it was barely breaking the 50% barrier. You are already used to these numbers, for example, for the DPS. In this case, Havoc and Assassination were very popular, but the tank one is a bit lower than what we are used to see now. Even in Season 2, for the first almost 3 months of the season, Prot Warrior was gaining over Blood DK, but it was again barely breaking 50%. You still had Havoc and Outlaw being super popular. In fact, Outlaw was so popular you were basically running double Outlaw in your keys. Season 3 was even more balanced for tanks in BFA. And even Season 4 was even more balancer than Season 3 when it comes to tanks. While you still had your dominance of DPS, because of course who does the most damage gets in, you had your popular DPS in BFA. You move over to Shadowlands, is more or less the same. Vengeance starts to be popular at the beginning and doesn't even last a full season, because towards the end of Season 1, Vengeance was already losing out to Guardian. Season 2 begins, Guardian is the popular one now, but just barely. It barely breaks into the 40% representation in the high-level keys of Mythic Plus. And even for the first 3 months of Season 3, which is what players remember as the beginning of the god comp of Holy Priest, Blood DK, Survival, Destruction Warlock back then, actually for the first 3 months of the season, which is just basically how far we are now in Season 2 of the War Within, it was also very, very balanced when it comes to tanks. When we had the full-on domination of this comp was for the remainder of Season 4. The first of the fated meme seasons at the end of the expansion, at the end of Shadowlands. Now, when we got into Dragonflight is when we started to see more dominance of a particular tank. Not even in Season 1, actually. It started, of course, with the Exodia comp in Season 2. You had the Holy Paladin, Guardian, Shadow, Fire, and Og with the release of Augmentation. From Season 2 to Season 3, there is a similar level of dominance, but this time is Vengeance instead of Guardian, and for the last season of Dragonflight, it was again Vengeance, with a very, very familiar level of numbers you see here for the tank. 93, 94, 97% of the tanks being just Vengeance. And this is what we carried over in the War Within. These numbers are the ones you're used to, for example, in Season 1 with Prot Paladin, and now in Season 2 for Vengeance. So these numbers, when it comes to tanks, have massively increased since basically the mid part of Dragonflight to now. We are now 5 seasons in a row, the last 3 of Dragonflight and the first 2 of the War Within, where the tank dominance is extreme. Is well above the old 40 to 50% we saw in Shadowlands or in BFA. We are now in the 80 to 90% for tanks. Now this leads us to believe, of course, that now it means that those tanks bring something that justifies them being upwards of 90+% of all tanks in those keys. Not even healers, since tank you only bring 1 in the key, healer you only bring 1 in the key, but the DPS you have more options. Not even the healer, which has the same slots, the same spots in a group as a tank, had this level of dominance, except for the very first few weeks of the Exodia comp back in Season 2 of Dragonflight with Holy Paladin. But in the further seasons, the healer was always slightly below the tank because you had a few more options to run the healer alongside that particular tank. Even now, for example, you have Discipline, of course, as the main pick, but Discipline is some 10 to 15, sometimes even 20% behind the tank of choice, in this case Vengeance. So amongst the two, the one that is being picked the most and considered the more vital to your group is the tank again. So quite a few players have made the connection that it's because of the kick and the interrupt change. Since now we have entered a situation in the War Within where it is much more important to get our interrupts right rather than getting our crowd control right, the power of the specs with the most amount of interrupts and stops in general that can be, chained after one another to try to keep the mobs down and stop them from casting, those are the tanks that become the most valuable. What is our evidence? Well, our evidence is that the 2 tanks with the most amount of these 2 things are Prot Paladin and Vengeance, and those have been the 2 meta tanks in Season 1 and in Season 2. And technically also in Dragonflight the past few seasons it was Vengeance, back when Vengeance had still their double sigil charges and they could, double sigil of chains, double sigil of silence, right, before it was removed in the War Within. So many players pointed out at specs, at handicapped specs like Brewmaster or Guardian Druid. What can these 2 specs do to match Vengeance in terms of stops, crowd control, stuns, interrupts? What can Brewmaster do? They have a melee interrupt like Vengeance, a single target melee interrupt, they have an AoE stun, and a Ring of Peace. Their paralysis is comparable to Imprison, so what they are lacking compared to Vengeance, you have a sigil of chains, the sigil of misery, the sigil of silence that Vengeance can bring. And same goes for Guardian Druid. Guardian Druid is possibly even worse than even Brewmaster, if you compare it, for example, to Prot Paladin. Between their mass interrupt of Divine Toll with their Avenger shields blasting everywhere and their normal Avenger shield giving them a very high uptime on their interrupts, can offer much more control of mobs compared to Guardian Druid. Now, a couple of the other tanks can offer something, not quite at the level of Vengeance, but at least they're not completely useless. For example, Blood Decay does have Gorfin's Grasp. A talented Gorsphin Grasp to turn it into a 90-second AoE silence. So they can match the 90 seconds Sigil of Silence of Vengeance, but then they don't have the Chain Sigil. Basically, Gorsphin's Grasp combines Sigil of Chains with Sigil of Silence, which is a bad thing because you want to keep them spread. You want to first interrupt all the enemies by grouping them together, and once they start casting again, then you want to interrupt them, which is what you can do as a Vengeance, but you cannot do as a Blood Decay. A similar thing can also be done by Prot Warrior. Prot Warrior does have their AoE Taunt, Challenging Shout, which they can talent and turn into Disrupting Shout, which again is a 90-second cooldown interrupt, not even a silence. So they can offer some kind of scuffed alternatives to what Vengeance can bring, but Vengeance is clearly the best out of these 3 for this season. So there has been, by some players, this kind of idea that with the change of Blizzard to the way the interrupts and the kicks are required in Mythic Plus now, it has ruined the chances of some tanks into becoming powerful or viable or meta, and then obviously massively favored others. And then also speculated based on the very high popularity, the very high dominance of tanks in keys compared to the other roles. Since, as we have just looked at, from the beginning of Mythic Plus to now, no other role has grown to be as dominating as tanks. whenever there is a spot to fill. Tanks are the ones who always rise to basically the highest number possible, basically close to 100%. For a DPS to be that high, they would have to be basically at 33%. If you assume every DPS in the group will be of a different spec, then the max for them would be 33, 33, 33. And even now and in previous seasons, the DPS would sit at like 20 to 25% on average, which is far below in comparison to, for example, the 96, 97% that Protection Paladin peaked at last season, and the currently almost 90% of Vengeance Demon Hunter. And the assumption, of course, is that the reason why tanks get to grow to be so much more dominant over a season is because they are brought for a particular thing that they do much better than the other tanks. So eventually it becomes much harder for you to basically miss what they can bring in a key over another DPS. As another DPS, yes, Unholy is the strongest one doing turbo AoE, but then again, Red Paladin is not that much worse than Unholy. It's not a massive downgrade to your group to replace an Unholy DK for a Red Paladin, which is not the same. It's not the same to say, for example, replacing Vengeance with another tank. Now, the misconception here, though, is that at the end of the day, the tank that is being chosen most of the times, despite seemingly being because they bring these best things for your group, in this case we're talking about interrupts and mob control, is because they are the tankiest ones. At the moment, Vengeance is also, despite the fact that they have Sigil of Chains and Silence and they can control mobs and allow them to pull very fast because they're very mobile, group mobs together and then chain them together and then drop down the Balanced Druid beam to silence them, and once that beam is over they can use their own Sigil of Silence to extend the silence on the enemy group. Even despite all of that, they also happen to be the tankiest one. They were already a default very tanky tank compared to the others. With the tier set this season, their tier set is far stronger than the other tanks' tier sets, since their ability to reset the hunt and the interaction it has with their talents, and more importantly their hero talents, is much more powerful than what the other tanks can get. It is very, very powerful. They also are one of the few tanks with a freebie of a cheat death they can get, as opposed to tanks like Brewmaster, Guardian or Prot Warrior. So it's not just the benefit that players saw at a surface level. For example, we are doing magic damage in our group because Balance does magic damage, Mage does magic damage, Unholy actually. Shadow damage is magic damage still, so Vengeance giving us the 5% magical damage debuff basically works for all of us, which is very good. And then, the crowd control they offer, the AoE stun, the Sigil of Silence, the Sigil of Chains, all of that, the cheat that, it's all very, very good, but also they start from the base of being the tankier tank. It's the same for last season with Protection Paladin. Protection Paladin required a bit more tinkering, to be fair. They had to rotate their externals a bit better than a Vengeance Demon Hunter. They had more vulnerable windows than a Vengeance Demon Hunter. They had nowhere near the same safety of a cheat death mechanic compared to a Vengeance Demon Hunter. They still had their possible bubble and their Ardent Defender pseudo cheat death, but nowhere near as safe as a Vengeance. They had to require a much bigger help from their Discipline Priest, dishing out pain suppressions on them to keep them alive. But ultimately it wasn't just because they had a lot of interrupts, a lot of silences and stops for the group, it was also because they could pull that level of high keys, and they were the best at doing it, which was something much different with Vengeance. The reason why Vengeance was non-existent in Season 1, but very prominent now, is because comparatively speaking, the amount of tank buster and very, very dangerous one-shotting style of hits on tanks in Season 1 was much more prominent than it is now. Now it's a much more chill season in terms of very heavy to defend against single hits for tanks, which is why Vengeance has a much easier time now compared to Season 1, on top of all of the buffs they received between Season 1 and Season 2. So it can be a combination of both. Definitely Vengeance in this season, or Paladin last season, they weren't exactly or exclusively meta because of the amount of interrupts they could bring to the group, but also because they were the tankier ones. However, imagine if, for example, Blood DK or Prot Warrior were just as tanky as Vengeance this season, would have they been brought to a key? Would they become the meta tank? Well, No, because on top of the tankiness of Vengeance, they also have all of the other things we mentioned. The magical damage debuff, the cheat that AoE stuns, sigils, chains, fears, etc, etc, etc. So it is a bit of both, but definitely not just because of Blizzard's change to the interrupt style in Mythic Plus, which is essentially the only reason why Vengeance or Prot Paladin will ever be the meta tanks as long as this lasts. The idea that even next season we can look forward to Vengeance or Prot Paladin being meta because they are the ones who interrupt the most. And since you can look forward to next season, another season where you are pulling 3 different packs with 6 different casters, maybe you even have Discipline being the meta healer, meaning 0 interrupt on your healer. So the best way to manage these 6 casting mobs in the pack is to have someone like a Vengeance or someone like a Prot Paladin that can more easily deal with that high amount of interrupts. It will also have to be because the tank itself is tanky. It can actually survive the hits to begin with. And then, if it can survive the hits to begin with, then also everything else it can bring is just an extra. But at the same time, we can't just ignore the fact that the other tanks who don't have these extras start from, from a handicap position. Because as we mentioned, even if we imagine a world where this season Brewmaster Monk was, let's say 5% tankier than Vengeance, or even 10. Let's give it a 10% tankier state than Vengeance. So in any key, basically any plus 21 something key, your Brewmaster is 10% chance less likely to die than a Vengeance in any given pool. If that Brewmaster is also buffing you with a physical damage buff you're not doing, so practically your entire group does 5% less damage now because they lost the Vengeance magical damage debuff. You also have no Sigil of Chains and Sigil of Silence to chain together with the beam of the Balance Druid. So your managing of the interrupts and possibly even the size of your pools has to change because you cannot manage those large pools without the Vengeance Demon Hunter. Your Brewmaster Monk also doesn't have a cheat death in case of something going wrong for a tank compared to a Vengeance. Would that be better overall, just because the Brewmaster Monk is 10% tankier than the Vengeance Demon Hunter? That would be seen pretty much as a handicap for a tank like a Brewmaster or a Guardian or a Prot Warrior, and even, most of the time for a Blood DK as well. The fact that at the end of the day, sure, who is more important when it comes to tanking is the one that is tankiest, but if the one that are tankiest have such little utility that they can bring to the group, that tanks with more utility can afford to be maybe 5% less tanky, 10% less tanky, and still be chosen because of all of the other things they can bring to the group, then those tankier tanks with less utility start from a disadvantaged position in the race to being meta in Mythic Plus. And the question of this one, whether or not this was the tank's fault that we are asking ourselves, is towards shaping the meta, because ultimately you can only do certain pulls because you have the sigils of the Vengeance. You could only do certain pulls because you had the bubble, taunt, invulnerability phase of a Prot Paladin, followed by mass interrupts of Divine Toll, or multiple fast, much higher paced interrupts of a Prot Paladin compared to other tanks. Or in some cases, even going all the way back to Dragonflight, the double sigil cycle of Vengeance in Season 3 and Season 4 of Dragonflight was about the same thing. The amount of mob control no other tank could even come close to reaching back then. So the amount of enemies, the size of your pools was decided by a Vengeance, which then means the amount of enemies you're fighting, the amount of mobs you're fighting is going to entice a certain group, a certain damage profile of your DPS. More larger AoE numbers, less uncapped AoE specs, more slow and ramping AoE specs like Shadow Priest have a better chance to shine if Vengeance can control that many more mobs. So it was the question on whether or not the entire shaping of the Mythic Plus meta starts from the strongest tank and then trickles down on the other roles of your group. Starting with the healer, which is halfway decided by how much healing is required, the healing checks that are required in the keys, and then how much is required to keep the tank alive, and then going on to the DPS. Most of it will be trying to split how much AoE damage you need compared to how much single target, funnel prio damage you need, and then weigh that damage against the size of pools that the tank allows you to have, based on how tanky the tank is and how much mob control he can have in a group. Because there is no point, for example, for a Brewmaster Monk to be as tanky as a Vengeance, allowing them to pull 15 mobs and survive just like a Vengeance Demon Hunter, if out of those 15 mobs there are 7 casters. And now you don't have the interrupts to stop those 7 casters. And now you have the familiar sight many tanks have seen before, where they are the last ones alive in the pool. And each and every one of the other players dies one by one after multiple double void bolt casts, one shot each player, one at a time, because you just don't have enough stops and CC to stop them from casting. This one was our deliberation for today on the state of tanks and their power level, their power to shape a Mythic Plus group right now. Halfway because of how they are balanced, and the other halfway is because of how Blizzard balances the dungeons. Obviously, much of this is bound to change since we have just gotten recently the mentions of Blizzard on how they want to tone down the help of add-ons, which also includes things like interrupt lists, as well as nameplate helpers like the cast bars or even the cooldown of the spells on the enemy NPCs, to then also slow down and limit how many of these cards are going to come off. So maybe it won't even be nearly as necessary to change anything regarding the tank power in the future, because it will be Blizzard themselves to change the way Mythic Plus works. But for now, this is how things have been going for the tanks recently, as we have shown in the past 4 to 5 seasons. The dominance of a single spec for tanks is much more prominent compared to the dominance of a single spec for healers and 3 unique specs when it comes to Mythic Plus DPS choices. And we have deliberated that it is a little bit of both. A little bit of being the tankier one, but also being the tankier one is just not enough. You need to be the tankier one and also bring enough crowd control, enough help to control the group, not just simply being able to stay alive yourself as a tank. That is a situation we have right now so far for the tanks in this season, and also in this expansion, and even in the last expansion as well. So for today, this is what we had to talk about on this Tuesday, and with this out of the way, we can now, deliberate by ourselves in our own rooms about this current situation and think about a better future. So with this out of the way, it is now time to leave each other. We are starting the goodbyes, of course, by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who's been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, there must be a mistake. This thing right here is saying 26 degrees. I think it missed. It miswrote a 2 for a 3, actually.